Okay, hello everyone, and thank you all for joining us today as we continue our Pathy Fellowship presentations this week. My name is Nyla, and I'll be introducing the session today. Just a quick note that I'm having some tech difficulties, so I'll be keeping my camera off for today. And we also have Lauren here, another Pathy Fellow who's going to moderate some discussion after Ben's presentation. I want to start off with acknowledging that I occupy and live on the traditional unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. And this unceded land holds great historical, spiritual, and personal significance for its original stewards and peoples of this region. I encourage you all to reflect about the land that you are on, and if comfortable, pop it in the chat so that we know where you folks are joining in from today. It is such an honor to introduce my friend and fellow Ben for his final fellowship presentation. A warm welcome to all of Ben's friends, family, and colleagues and loved ones who have joined us here today on Zoom or on Facebook Live to hear about the incredible impact Ben has had in his community this year. Before I introduce Ben and his project, I want to go over some housekeeping items. A quick note that the presentation is being recorded and will be posted later to the Pathy Fellowship YouTube page. Ben will start off his 25-minute presentation with beautiful stories on his learnings, the work he's done, and what his community has ahead of them. I encourage you to flood the chat box and live stream with any questions, thoughts, and admiration, of course, that you have for Ben and his work, because Lauren will be moderating another 20 to 25-minute question and answer period after. If you have any tech concerns or accommodation needs, please feel free to let us know via the chat, and consider turning off your microphone and cameras to limit any background noise to help with connectivity. So, who is Ben? Ben Heywood-MacLeod is a part-time shepherd, full-time grandson and brother, and a budding community organizer. He grew up in the countryside of Grey County and graduated with a double major in international development and philosophy at McGill University. He's worked in cocktail bars and roadside diners, farms, and a lighthouse, and so is getting accustomed to inhabiting different worlds. Over this year, though, he's returned home where he's bridging local neighbors with descendants of a historic Black community to work together on racial justice and heritage preservation. With the support and gentle nudging of Carolyn and Sylvia Wilson of the Sheffield Park Black History Museum, Ben has facilitated gatherings and returns to ancestral homesteads, compiled a digital archive with community input and direction, and is shifting the local narratives of race, belonging, and what it means to be a good neighbor, one porch visit at a time. I am so grateful for this fellowship to have met and have had the chance to get to know Ben and call him my friend. Ben has this innate ability to capture a room with his storytelling, his wisdom, and most importantly, his kindness. I truly admire his fierce gentleness, his courage to lead much needed uncomfortable conversations, and his passionate and joyful, contagious energy that often leaves people feeling safe and heard. With that, I'm excited for you all to be mesmerized by this amazing human. So over to you, Ben.
Thank you very much, Nyla, and thank you all for coming today. I'm excited to share what I've been up to this year, what I've learned, and some local history as I've learned it. I just wanted to start by acknowledging that it's been a kind of a constant paradox for me on how to share these stories, which are not mine in a sense and are collectively ours in another sense. So the way that I've answered that paradox this afternoon is by dropping something in your chat box. That's a video that we co-produced in Community. So if you'd like to hear other voices on these topics, I'd really recommend that you check that out anytime. We're pretty proud of it. So yes, today I'm talking about healing collective memory through community bridging, specifically around a Black History site that's just underneath my hometown, which is at Negro Creek Road. Now, what I've been up to was kind of the intersection between anti-racism work locally through local heritage preservation. So the premise was that we can address legacies of racial harm through healing community memory. That was the experiment. And an abolitionist scholar that I really look up to, Miriam Kaba, she says we need thousands of different experiments toward liberation. So in the presentation that follows, I'm going to take you on that little experiment that we did at this intersection, this small intersection in rural Ontario. Now, as you can see, Negro Creek, that's an uncomfortable name. Ostensibly, it's a racist name, and we're going to get into that because it's significant. Um, it's also, I wanted to advise folks that I'm going to be dealing with themes of racial violence and harm in this presentation. You can believe that I'm going to deal with them as sensitively as I can, but I just wanted to give a heads up to folks on that as well. Lots of stories of beauty, joy, and abundance, bravery, and courage to follow as well. So I would like to start just with a quote from James Baldwin, which has really helped me think through the work. He writes, "History, as nearly no one seems to know, is not merely something to be read, and it does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and it's literally present in everything that we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, since it's to history that we owe our frames of reference, our identities, and our aspirations." So, with that in mind, I'm going to try and historicize myself and the land before I give you a sense of what we've been up to. So, this is where I grew up. That's me on the left, twerking on the table at my grandparents'. I was really I consider myself really fortunate to have grown up where I did in rural Ontario, smack dab in the middle of an Amish settlement, which is to say that all of the houses around me didn't have electricity. It was horse and buggy. You can see below my sister riding um, on the trailer that's behind the horses. That's when they're collecting sap just a little bit earlier around this time of year. And to the right is our neighbor visiting us. So we were the only house with electricity for a, kind of a while away. What that meant is that I got the unique, these days, relatively unique experience of living in a community of interdependence, which is to say, they were coming over all the time to use our telephone. We would drive them to the hospital when one of them was pregnant or broke their leg. And on the flip, we would go there for eggs and we would get maple syrup and all sorts of little things. They would blow out our laneway, horse powered. And you know, there was ugliness to that relationship too, as there is with any relationship. Like our dog ate their chickens one year, and that same year they shot our dog, but the dog survived. But really, at the end of the day, there was this deep reciprocity and care between neighbors. So, for example, we didn't have too many means for a good chunk of my childhood. And so, when we wanted to build a woodshed, folks came out and relied on that old culture of barn raising in a day. We had a work bee, they put it up. Later, we had a horrible fire in that woodshed. And when you're in the countryside, the fire department is a ways away. I know some of you are joining rurally, so you know that. The neighbors were there immediately, hosing down the house and making sure that we were safe. So quite quite a formative childhood experience. And I've learned this year how unique that is. So we're looking right now at a photo of Negro Creek, and I've had the chance to meet a lot of the residents on Negro Creek Road, and one of them told me this story that I'd love to share with you. Um, so she and her husband are living on this road, and they've just moved there from Toronto, and they're getting to know the neighborhood. And kind of across the road, down a little ways, there's a field with a horse in it. Now, what they know is there's an old woman that lives in that house, and as they go past it every day in the summer and the fall, they're noticing that the horse is getting weaker and weaker. And what they hear through the grapevine is that this old woman who lives there has grown sick herself, and so isn't making it out of bed to feed the horse anymore. And so, another day goes by and they drive past and the horse is weaker. And another day goes by, they drive past, the horse is weaker, and they're thinking to themselves, oh, that's just awful. Like, this is horrible to see. Um, and another day goes by, and then they see one of their other neighbors one afternoon. They're driving out, and he's I got the sense that Iveta, this neighbor, doesn't get along with him too well, because he's a local, he's uh, a self-described hick, and he was carrying buckets. And she said, well, what are you doing with those buckets? We'll call him Ed. And he looked at her kind of exasperated, and he said, well, I'm going over to feed Mary's horse. And I guess what he said afterward to her was that around here, you don't have to be friends with your neighbor. You don't have to like your neighbor, but you have to be a good neighbor. So I'll go back to that neighborhood ethic in a little while because it's really informed the work. But first, in the spirit of Baldwin, I'd like to give you a bit of a history lesson about this small intersection. I'm going to try and do it in 5 minutes. 200 years of history in 5 minutes. I'm obviously going to gloss over some things, but you'll bear with me as I give it to you the best I can. So this is research that was uncovered by local researchers, Anna Scott. Stories have been kept, oral histories for generations, as well as new research by our resident archivist and descendant, Nancy Lee. So the Negro Creek area, it's, let me just throw up the spotlight here. It's right about here in Saugeen Anishinaabeg, so Saugeen Ojibwe traditional territories. Now, in the 1830s, the government of Canada, the Crown at that time, is rapidly settling this area, and they're securing land from First Nations and, of course, dispossessing them in the process through these treaties. These folks were there for at least 15,000 years, were the Stuarts, and traveled along the Saugeen River, which connects to Negro Creek. And in 1836, Treaty 45 and a half was enforced, enacted is the word that we used. Basically, they gave up this lower portion in ways that we understand now were unjust, under the promise from the Crown that they would protect this upper part, the Saugeen Peninsula, now called the Bruce Peninsula after a lord, um, from encroachment of the whites forever, is what they said. They said, if you give up this lower part, we will promise to protect this land for you from encroachment of these white settlers who keep coming in and settling and ruining your lives. Well, 17 years later, they broke that promise, the government did, and went back to the table and said, oh, I'm sorry, it turns out that we can't protect you from the encroachment of the whites, so you're going to have to sign over some more land. And that treaty is currently in the courts. So this is very topical. At the same time, they, right after that second treaty was signed, there was a letter sent to the county sheriff, and it said, we want you to summarily eject all squatters from the land. So in 1854, the government began removing all squatters. Now, squatters meant First Nations people, It also meant anybody that the government didn't think was a legitimate landowner at the time. And that's where we intersect with my local Black history of the area. So at the same time as this colonial expansion is happening through Canada, the US is firmly in their slave economy. And abolition, so emancipation of slavery, happens in Canada in the 1830s from the tireless work of Black abolitionists and some white allies. So we get there a little bit earlier. We still had slaves, but we enslaved people, but we got there a little earlier. And so what that meant is that thousands of freedom seekers were moving from the US into Ontario, what was then Canada West. So 15,000 roughly freedom seekers made their way up in that same period. And the government had a deal for them. They said, okay, if you clear the land, this old growth forest, and you make productive farms that you can cultivate your crop from, then we'll give you the land for free, and you have a few years to do it. So some specific families, the Millers, the Gordons, the Barnes, the Douglases, these are young families. They made the trek up, most from Maryland, all the way up to Negro Creek, where they settled by the creek because it provided sustenance and was a life force. It was also a transportation route, and they started erecting these log cabins. Now, this was tireless work that was incredibly dangerous, incredibly hard, and there were wolves and bears. There were not provisions. There was disease. We find in this one article, one of the families, the settler named Barnes, he actually dies of starvation in the process. This is from an 1860s report. And he didn't have, he didn't have enough to feed himself and his family, so he fed his family. And I imagine his neighbors too. But they persevered through strong kinship ties, both with each other. With the Saugeen Ojibwe of the time, we have some records of this. And as you see on the left, that's a marriage between the Saugeen Anishinaabeg and one of the Black settlers, as well as with their white neighbors, who at that point were Scottish and Irish working class. So the community starts to grow in the 1840s. People have children, grandchildren. For these Black settlers, the first literate generation goes to school from decades of enslavement. And they're getting married, they're marrying each other. These kinship ties are growing. There are children running around, and it's a vibrant agricultural community. I like the story of Isaiah Chucky, who he actually arrived from Africa. He was jumping ships to escape slavery and made it to a port city, came down to work in Negro Creek as a farmhand, fell in love with the farmer Henry Miller's daughter. They got married, had a kid, and then he set up right across the road. So this is the Douglas family and some others, the farmers of the area, a little bit later. And unfortunately, we see after 1851 dispossession begin to happen. So basically, once the land was cleared, the foundations were built, the farming became productive, and the roads were built, many of them by these early Black settlers. The land value went up significantly, and at that same time, there was a large influx of British settlers, mostly, who had more means. And at that point, land agents started coming by to question people about their legal holding of the land. Now, many of these families had done it legitimately. They had received what's called a location ticket, which they took that deal, they worked hard, but when the land agent came and said, well, where's your patent? Some of them weren't able to provide it for them because it had been 30, 40 years. These are grandchildren. Others, like James Douglas, he fought hard to keep his land. Now, this Nancy Lee did this research. She just showed it to us last week in a group. He fought for 30 years, writing petitions to the government. He even got the land agent to write a petition in his favor. He got community partners. He got other neighbors. He got businessmen. Everybody was writing in his favor, and still the government didn't grant him the land that he had raised his grandchildren on. But then another neighbor, a white neighbor, an affluent merchant named Robert Gillies, he says, "Well, actually, I'm gonna apply for the land," and he got it immediately. Now, very fortunately, Robert Gillies, we think, was working with James Douglas and sold the land back to James Douglas at a reasonable rate. So we assume that there was some cooperation going on there, but it just goes to show how these legal and social means dispossessed this community of their lands. Now, many of them were forced to leave. Some of them stayed. Many of them were forced to leave, but they harvested the seeds of their community and planted them in other communities, Owen Sound, Collingwood, Toronto. Now their history continues there, and they are much better equipped. Descendants are much better equipped to share those stories. Our history locally, unfortunately, takes a much darker turn. These are newspaper clippings that you can see here on your screen, and I'm not going to read them, but this is from the period afterward, and it gets progressively more violently racist. Now, the thing about newspaper clippings is that they demonstrate that there was a social license for these feelings. There were acts of racial terror, but they were upheld through a social license. 1920 in Oakville, the Klan breaks up a black and white marriage, and they kidnap the woman, and they assault the black man. And the mayor of Oakville says he was quite impressed at what the Klan did and how they were able to operate with great decorum, and they set a wonderful example for the people of Oakville in dealing with this heinous situation, which is very disturbing, of course. Now, that couple, they do have a happy ending. They actually went to the First Nations reserve nearby, Six Nations, and they got married there under the protection of their Indigenous friends. 1930s through to the 1960s, the graves of these early settlers are desecrated by the local community. So what you see here are community members that I've taken over the year, rubbing and etching on some of the graves that are still preserved. The one on the left is on private property and could be destroyed at any time. And the two, the middle and the right, actually were destroyed. They were plowed over into a potato patch. And it was only through this decades of activism afterwards that those graves were found in stone piles and put back together. And more graves are still scattered. And unfortunately at Negro Creek, and this is a difficult story, so just bear with me. We have an oral history account of the cemetery of the Millers, the Barnes, the Gordons, some of the Douglases. It was paved over in the 1960s when the highway was widened. And it's, to this day, those ancestors aren't commemorated in that spot. Now that's, of course, it's an act of physical erasure. It's also an act of spiritual erasure, because now descendants can't visit their ancestors. There's no proof. There's no proof that they ever existed on this land, except for the road sign. Now in the 90s, and some folks are on this call who took part in this fight. In the 90s, my local township changed the name Negro Creek in favor of a white settler name, Moggy. They said it was politically incorrect, and they were going to take that away. Now, of course, this was erasing the last marker of this vibrant history, and descendants community friends, activists, said there's no way that this is going to happen, and they fought back, and they had to fight hard. They ended up taking it to the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal, but they did secure the name, and the name stays to this day. Now, I wouldn't have known any of that history because when I asked my parents about this peculiar name that we drove past every day, they said they didn't know. I'm sure as a kid, I asked others, didn't really know. I think there were slaves here, is what some people said. Other people still refer to it as N-word Creek locally. So the community memory, individual memory, of course, people were around in the 90s and remember this fight. But in terms of collective community memory, it had been completely erased. Now, there were a few people that were trying to preserve that history and hold on to it. Locally, there were a few, not many. But beyond locally, there were quite a few. Now, I'm just going to check the time because I could get quite carried away. So as you can see by these photos that span from the 70s, 80s, 90s to present, it's still a deeply significant site for many people. There was a nationally touring play written about it. And of course, to the descendants, it's where their ancestors are from. And so many descendants had found themselves drawn to this place, even if they didn't actually know the physical connection because it wasn't written in the history books. They still found themselves drawn to it. The question that we were faced with then, that I was faced with as I learned this from Carolyn and Sylvia of the Black History Museum, and was, what are we going to do about this? Because the road signs are continually vandalized and stolen. To them, that's an act of racial violence, and I understand it that way too now after hearing the stories of repeated racial violence in the area. When you take the long view of history, you start to understand that a road sign being stolen over and over again, it's not just some hooligan, it's the legacy of generations and generations of erasure. So what do we do? Because we got to be real. This is a predominantly white, very conservative, rural locality with a long history of racial violence. So the sorts of solutions that we have, they might not come to mind very quickly. You know, do we call the police? Well, are the police actually going to solve the underlying problems? I personally don't think that they have the tools for that. And I think again about Mariame Kaba, the abolitionist, who really encourages through transformative justice to look to solutions that extend beyond further conflict. So like putting up a trail cam and catching the vandal and charging them, to accountability, building accountability at the community level. So Carolyn and Sylvia and I, we got down, we sat around in their museum. They have a beautiful space, and we got thinking together. And they taught me this ethic of love and of neighbor coalition building. Basically, white folks, locals, had to realize that it was our story as well. Collectively, it was the story of our community, and we had a responsibility to that story. That's a lesson that took me a long time, but it was one that they kept on drilling into my head, and I now understand why it's so important to think that way. So we figured that the best course of action would be one that restored local kinship ties between descendants, because in dispossession, it's kinship ties that are broken. And in racial violence at the local community, oftentimes any type of violence in a community is due to the breakdown of kinship ties. So whatever solution, it had to include locals, it had to restore kinship ties, and it had to be, I figured it had to be grounded in the strengths of the local community, which, as I mentioned at the top, was these strengths of neighbor ethics. You don't have to like your neighbor, but you have to be a good neighbor. Now, that's something that resonates really well, and I learned at a Ella Baker School of Organizing class. They taught that in conservative spaces, moral values around loyalty and duty and authority, those resonate really strongly with people. So if you can kind of bring your message in those registers, you can make a lot of on the ground change. If we were in Toronto or another urban center, we would protest. We'd be able to get out there. Here, the situation was just, it's too dangerous for that kind of strategy. And instead, we needed to build bridges and strong coalitions. Harken back to these stories of the Underground Railroad, of, safe houses and, white allies who were helping in our collective liberation. So that's what we did. We gathered. We brought the right people around the table, which took a lot of time, and we had to move at the speed of trust. I had to move at the speed of trust, but I brought the experts. And when I say the experts, I mean the experts through their lived experience and the knowledge that they held around to figure things out at our first gathering. And I can tell you lots of stories about the gatherings. At our first gathering, it was just descendants and knowledge holders. We had Adam from the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation there as well. At our next gathering, we invited other neighbors to come, build relationships, and there were a few rules at these gatherings. One of them, which I really loved, I took this from an Octavia Butler book, was that the food in the gatherings had to be only food that was brought by the community. So the first gathering, we ate soup. It was a good soup, but it was just soup. And my grandparents, they made some bread and made a pot of coffee, and we ate. It was fine. The next gathering, we did a little bit better. The next gathering, we had a feast, and the local businesses were offering tea and coffee. The community center manager was herself bringing a salad. People were bringing butter tarts, and so the other rule was that informal time at these gatherings, sure, we were making consensus-based decisions on how to go forward, but I made sure that 50% of the time was informal. And that was for the relationship building piece, because to me, sustainability, I mean, you can put up a commemorative plaque, it could get stolen, but the thing that is going to sustain are the stories, folks' connection to the land, and folks' connection to each other. So we really tried to prioritize that. So in the first gathering, descendants and knowledge holders collectively identified priorities going forward. Those priorities, they wanted something physical on the ground to connect with the history and to be a tangible memory for everybody, for community members, as well as for people passing through, as well as for descendants to go. They also wanted local awareness to be raised. So break through this strange aphasia or inability to speak or collective forgetting that was happening locally that would allow this history to be erased and for these violences to continue. So break through that with local awareness. Finally, to do something about the desecration of their ancestors' graves. We're still really working on that one. That's a really difficult piece, and it's one that's ongoing in discussion. After our second gathering, the road signs were cut down, and it was I'll be honest, it was a really difficult call that I had to make to the descendants that I had brought into this process. And whereas locals used to see it as, the hooligans are up to it again, to descendants, my community, because it was they in my community, was cutting their history down. It was a violence that they felt deeply, and so they were really, really hard phone calls. But we had met and we had gathered. Community members had met them, had been called in, and so when this happened in February, by the way, just as Black History Month is starting, community members sprung into action. So You know, they were calling each other, they were calling me, people were sending photos of the road signs, people were calling the township to get them replaced. On our side, on the more organizing side, we coordinated media coverage and response. We had done a little bit of media training. So we said, okay, whose voice is most important right now? Those with the lived experience of this. And we were really successful. We were on the radio. We had local as well as national coverage that, you know, in this idea of transformative justice, um, centered the victims of the harm in describing that harm and outlining the steps that needed to be taken. Also found that when journalists are knocking on doors of government officials, stuff seems to get done a little bit faster, just like when the landowner, when the merchant Gillies um, applied for that crown patent land and Douglas had been working for 30 years to get it. Nothing was happening. As soon as the privileged person starts making some calls, things seem to happen. It shouldn't be like that, but it was. And so when journalists started knocking on the township door, the township said, well, we proclaim February to be Black History Month. To great applause from all of us. And it's not like that hadn't been a national thing for quite a while, but you know, little steps, little steps. We weren't going to let that deter us. We continued. You know, the other piece of this was building a knowledge base. So when I first tried to look into this history, when I was driving with my partner and we saw Negro Creek under a new light, and we were like, what the heck is going on with this road sign? When I Googled it, nothing came up. When I looked in the local history books, nothing came up. So we really needed to address that. And fortunately, we were blessed to have strong researchers and archivists supporting us, some of them direct descendants. So we took stuff like this that you see, census records, like the original surveys, and we were able to form narratives. Like the Douglas narrative is basically these 3 documents. And we put it onto a website that's accessible to all, negrocreek.community, www.negrocreek.community. You can go and you can actually see 10 of these families, not only their life stories, as far as we could gather, compiling oral history with the archives, but also the stories of the land and the dispossession. You can click it right on the map. So here, we're clicking Isaiah Chucky, who is he was that gentleman who fell in love with the farmer's daughter. I'm gonna, skip through because I'm really excited to hear your questions. But I just wanted to share one last initiative that we undertook more recently. Like I said, it was really important for folks to have a permanent marker of recognition on the land. Now, we're working on a permanent marker, but we figured in the meantime we could get some sort of temporary marker up. This happened after the signs were stolen. One of the locals, who's a dear friend now that I really respect and admire and appreciate, she was so angry. It had clicked in her, and she felt like it was they were offending her as well. And she said, "I just wish I could put something up and like show those vandals like that all that they're doing is making this history, making it a bigger deal so that the history is shared." And I said, well, that's beautiful, abundant thinking. Let's take that anger and let's make something beautiful. And so what we did is we got these knowledge holders, descendants, together. We worked on some wording, and someone called. They heard our story on the radio. He said, "I make road signs for the township and the highways. I'd love to make you a road sign." We said, "Great, let's do it." And we used the art that you saw earlier through the presentation. That's Tony Miller. He's an incredible artist. He's also the great grandson of Henry Miller, who was an early settler at Negro Creek. And Henry and Priscilla, I should say, and we put it together. We met as neighbors. We figured out, okay, well, how are we going to do this? We met on the porch. We chatted. One of the neighbors said, well, why don't we put it right on my property? It's visible to the whole, surrounding area. When you stop at the road sign, you can see it. And the next day, I put some invitations into mailboxes, and I called up some of my neighbor friends, and my grandfather came and pounded in the post, and we put it up. Right beside, we put a QR code so that you could click on to find out more about the history of the treaties, about the lives of the early Black families. This is a photo of our sign. Now, on the day I kept on saying sign erection celebration. Of course, that has a particular ring to it that I regret. So it's the sign installation celebration, and uh, we shared some stories with neighbors, and um, one of the most profound moments of my year was that I passed out little slips of paper, and on those pieces of paper were the names of these early families, individuals, first and last names, and we ran around, even the kids, and everybody read a few names. And so to me, that was the healing of collective memory. Now we had to get Descendants over, of course, to see the work that they had contributed so much to. And oh yeah, that's right. I just wanted to share one more story with you about that day. So after we all met as neighbors, we put it up. I rested with some neighbors. We had a beer on the porch and we chatted. We debriefed. Debriefing is so important. And when I was driving home, there were two pickup trucks that were stopped right by our sign, right on this intersection here. And I got closer and I saw that there were two men and a woman, all full camouflage, and they were yelling at the sign. Now, that's, of course, alarm bells and red flags. And this is still an area where white supremacy thrives. The leader of the Ku Klux Klan, the Western Division of the Ku Klux Klan, lived just a few townships away. So major red flags, but I got out of my car. I closed the door. I walked up. Ed, how are you doing, buddy? What do you think of these signs? I recognized him. He had a bit of a thing for my mum. They went curling together, and he was the same Ed who, and Ed's not his real name, but he's the same Ed who was lifting buckets. And so I said, Ed, I'm so sorry that you didn't make it. I sent you an email. And by the way, thanks for lending me these township history books. They were such a resource. And, we chatted. We talked about the history. They were using the N-word. They felt like their history wasn't reflected in it. And, we took the time and had a conversation. And by the end, two of the three people there had significantly changed their opinions. And so that was a real learning moment for me. And I guess later, when we brought Descendants, everybody brought a stone and from their home and solidified the sign with a stone. Now look at what you see on the left: neighbors and descendants, kinship ties being rebuilt. And there we all are, pointing up at this road sign. I'll just say thanks for listening. I want to get to your questions. Just a couple of learnings. Official efforts, and I got asked by locals from time to time, on whose authority are you putting up this road sign? Well, when structures of authority are deeply entrenched with systemic racism, I don't think that question makes as much sense as who are you accountable to? As a descendant told me once, and I'm thinking about this, we proclaim February Black History Month. He said to me when I told him that, he said, you can't take, and forgive my language, you can't take a piece of shit and wrap it in icing sugar and call it a donut. So that's a little gleam of wisdom that I learned. Also, organize your own. Because I'm a local, I was able to have those interactions on the what would be other side, recognize them as neighbors and call them in. And finally, love. It's not the master's tool, and that's what makes it so powerful. happy to take your questions. Thank you so much for listening. Feel free to turn your cameras on. Whew.
Oh, Ben. I have to agree with Nyla in the beginning there. You are just such an incredible storyteller, and it is always such a privilege to be able to hear you speak about your community, as well as the work that you and your neighbors have undertaken in the past year and beyond. So thank you so much for a job magnificently done. I have a question for you. So you obviously have a very deep understanding of the history of your land, and you've done a lot of reflection on your own positionality in this community and within anti-racist work. So how has this experience impacted your own relationship to the land and your hometown?
Lauren, dramatically, dramatically. For starters, when I started hearing these difficult stories, which I was completely oblivious to, but these really difficult stories about what has happened and what's continuing to happen on the land that I call home, I felt like it couldn't be a place um, for me, and my partner's marginalized, so it couldn't be a place for us. I began to feel unsafe, and that like, well, I can't bring my friends here. So that was the first reaction. I realized, oh shoot, like, wow. And then I was filled with hope by seeing neighbors come together and really say, okay, actually, no, this is enough. This is a problem that we want to step up and solve as a community. So my own relationship to the land has changed in that way. Also, my own kinship relations. I tried as hard as I could to bring my family into every element of this. Um, so my brother and sister, we snuck and liberated some stones from these ancestral homesteads, and my grandfather was pounding in posts. My mom and I kayaked Negro Creek at one point to figure things out. So my relationship with my family is a lot stronger through this process. As well as all of the love that I have for these other community members, these descendants. So it's been really transformative. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I know that you've been largely in Montreal for the past few years while you were studying at McGill. So it must have been nice, but also complex to come home and spend so much time in the place that you grew up and around your family and your community members.
Totally.
Yeah. So next question for you. This is a really powerful example of honoring complex overlapping histories. I wonder if you can speak to the importance of storytelling and oral history in this context, where violent attempts at erasure prevail.
Yeah, absolutely. So even in violent erasure, what I've learned is that you can't erase. Oh, we're recording. Oh. um, even in even in violent erasure, people remember, and even if they don't remember, facts, dates, names, things that we consider that we. When I say we, I mean white, sort of Western trained and inherited. Consider knowledge. They remember. So in any community, there are marginalized voices that hold truths that are obscured um, by biases in factual fact taking, but as well as these violences. So yeah, that's one. It really, like, oral histories address the shortcomings in our factual record.
Wow. I love your quote there. Even if a violent erasure has occurred, people still remember. That's so true. How might your work through the fellowship with your community provide a way forward for other communities hoping to preserve their own histories and work towards abundance and anti-racist futures?
Well, I just hope that they'll give us a call. So happy to share our learnings with any communities that are wrestling with similar themes. Um, I we haven't written a guide. We're still experimenting. Like I said, like Marianne Kaba said, we need thousands of different tiny experiments toward liberation. Excuse me, toward liberation and toward abolition. So, we're just in that experimenting stage. But it's like that's a good call to action and a reminder that we need to share as much as possible what we've learned so that others can draw from it. So, maybe a chapter in a community building textbook somewhere down the line. And my community is certainly well equipped to produce that sort of knowledge. Yeah.
And you operated from such an asset-based, community-driven development approach. Did you ever encounter any dissenting opinions from community members about how this history should be preserved, and how did you navigate that?
Oh God, yeah, I did. Yeah, for sure. And in fact, it was really disorienting for me, to be honest, because most of the year was locally was a total slog. Like, I did feel at points like I was going crazy and that I was doubting myself because what I was learning and what I was trying to bridge between the communities wasn't reflected on the land. It wasn't reflected in the sorts of stories that we told each other about our community. So it was almost yeah, it was really hard. But and I would even say schizophrenic in the sense that I felt like I was in many worlds at the same time, and uh, it didn't make sense a lot of the time. What I was able to do to ground myself was focus on the simple truths. So go back to the names, Henry Miller, Priscilla, you know James and Ellen Douglas, all of the go back, remember, okay, they were real people, they were here, and then to really lean on um, my community. That Carolyn and Sylvia Wilson were so generous and gentle, and as were other descendants, so kind, because they knew it, they knew these feelings, and so um, uh, we relied on each other in those ways. So being vulnerable to ask for help in that disorientation. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ben. I think we have time for one or two more questions. Can you speak more to the shift in the broad community after beginning this work in terms of their resistance and or acceptance of these difficult conversations?
Yeah. I like I've noticed locals empowered to advocate for this history. Whereas, before, because there was the social license for these sorts of racial harms, and there still is, it actually, people are really, like, I don't want to minimize that it's a scary thing to say, this isn't right, especially if people know where you live. And, my mother was, um, through the year, she was actually accosted by um, a white supremacist neo-Nazi at her work who was saying horrible things and threatening violence. So it's not little. It's not little by any means, but we've built these networks of care and support, and people are really stepping up. And I also did a survey. I walked door to door and visited a lot of porches along Negro Creek Road and out of the 11 households, 8 of them were really conversant and supportive of the history. They had heard the news stories, they had met the descendants, and so they are, well equipped to be stewards of this history now. Yeah.
Well, during your presentation, I was thinking about just the way you talk about your rural upbringing and going porch to porch, having these conversations with your neighbors. And I think that it's very interesting how this project was carried out in a rural setting. And I was just thinking about the differences if you had conducted this in an urban area, but we can chat about that later. I think we have time for one more question now. And that is, what was the media training like within the community? And how important was it to leverage journalism and media in a way that was in the community's control, where the narrative has been otherwise controlled outside of the community in ways that reinforce this erasure?
Right. So the specifics were that I, worked from my privileged position and my wide network to talk to an executive at a news organization who then shared some tips for us on how to write our own press release and gather together and say, okay, what is the story, who's best to speak on these things. And news media is great if you can, like, this is me talking in the context of anti-oppression work. News media is fantastic so long as you can control the narrative, which sometimes means vetting journalists, doing your homework a little bit, but then also like building up a roster of journalists that are friendly to the cause and sending them a little New Year's greeting and all that kind of thing to build those relationships. It's just the same. Yeah. And I just wanted to quickly, I know that we're wrapping up, but just thanks, Gord, for coming. And as is, where is what the real estate agents say when people try to move on to Negro Creek. It's like, you can buy this as is, where is, because for a lot of folks moving to Negro Creek, you can imagine like, oh my God. so as is, where is.
Well, you read my mind there. I was just about to say we can sneak in a really small question there, but thank you so much, Ben. I would love to share an appreciation from Elise, who said, "I'm humbled and grateful for your dedication, Ben. Much love, Elise." So I just wanted to share that with you and make sure you read the chat afterwards to see the love coming your way. But again, thank you so much for a phenomenal presentation, and thank you to everyone who joined today and for our discussion and all the lovely questions asked. And if you would like to rewatch this presentation or go back and get those little snippets of wisdom that Ben says every second word, you can go to the Pathy Fellowship YouTube channel or the Facebook page where this will be posted momentarily. Tomorrow we have we have 3 presentations coming up. We have Courtney, Dominique, and Emily who will be presenting. So join us on Facebook for those as well, or Zoom. And yes, I think we're good to go, folks. Thank you again for a wonderful afternoon, and we'll catch you at some other presentations.